Hey everybody, welcome to the showcase video of the French region pack in City Skylines II. Now the region packs are something that you can download for free on the Paradox mods, and Paradox has sponsored me for this video to showcase it to you guys, which has me very honored because it's amazing to be one of the first people to actually play this pack and be able to showcase it to the community. But it also has an extra meaning to me because 5 years ago I traveled with some friends to Paris to take pictures of buildings as reference, and these pictures turned into the French pack over the years, and that's what I'm able to show you guys today. Now, my main goal is to do a quick build of a French city, and I'm going to try to do this in one episode, so the detail isn't going to be quite out there and it's not going to be too big. But before I get into that, I want to showcase some of the most interesting things about the French pack and talk about it a little bit, and I'm just going to use this map as my blank slate and the developer tool as a way to get them. Now you can find them through Find It, or you can just use the game in vanilla mode and zone your places with the French pack zones. So for instance, we have the new medium density row housing zone, we have the new medium density housing, the mixed housing and low rent housing, and there's also the high density offices. And that's it for the zones. The pack also comes with some unique buildings which are worth showing off. So for instance, we have the hospital and the medical center. We also have some school and university buildings. We have the firehouse and fire station, and also the police station and police headquarters, as well as a city hall. There's a lot in this pack, I have to say, and I'm not going to show everything off in too much detail. I really recommend you download this and give it a try for yourself, but I think some of the details are worth pointing out before I get into this build. We also have a train station, quite nice, and those are some of the most interesting builds, I think. Now, something to realize about all of these buildings is that they do come with upgrades, and some of them are quite large, like the hospital, for instance. Some of them are also a little bit smaller, like for instance the terrace that we can get here with the medical center. But what I really wanted to show off is, well, and I think the developer menu is quite good for this because it showcases you just how much is in this pack. What I really wanted to show off is the crazy amount of zoned buildings that we get here. So if I type FR lower score, we find all of the buildings in the French pack, which includes some of the ones that I've just shown off, but also every single zoned building, and the list is huge. The amount of different variations of corner buildings and straight buildings in here, which are all based on or inspired by real buildings in Paris and also a few other places in France, is absolutely insane. And I think the level of detail is insane as well, and I think that's worth showing off for a little bit. So if we take, for instance, one of these office corner buildings, and then maybe we also take a mixed building, like this one, for instance, and let's also take a medium but quite large row of buildings here. And of course they're going to complain about surfaces, but something that's worth showing off here is that there are many different unique variations, and they also come with levels. So if I take, for instance, the level 1 variant of the medium density building that I got here, so that's 5x4, you can tell it's a little bit lower, which is really cool. And also, when you do zoom in, the detail on this is so insane. We have, for instance, unique balconies with unique fences on almost every building, and it might look like they're all the same, but if you zoom into them, you can notice this is a different texture and that is a different texture again. And then when we go to another building, here's another unique texture and another unique texture. The level of detail is just crazy. We also have all of the chimneys, which are typical for this style of architecture. And if I get another corner building, I might be able to showcase this. And yeah, I think this is a good one. On some of the corner balconies, we even have these textures that separate the different parts of a fence, as well as fences that separate one apartment from the other. So yeah, it's really cool. It's all Paris-based or Parisian-inspired architecture, and in some cases also from different parts of France. And it's all very Haussmann-esque. Without delving too much into the history of Paris, in the 19th century Paris got a very big makeover with these very typical buildings, and this is most of what you'll see in the French pack. But you can create more than just Paris with this. Many buildings all over France in different cities have this kind of architecture, so I think it's a very versatile pack, and you can use it for large or small cities, and maybe even for some other countries. Anyway, as a showcase and a proof of concept, I'm gonna be spending this episode trying to do just that and build a city in one go with this pack. So let's get started. So here we are, and as you might be able to tell, I didn't show you any of the map making because I simply took somebody else's map. This is the Bion 1:1 scale map made by Claudia de Fur on Paradox Mods, which is a really great map, and it only had 90 subscribers when I was looking at it, so I think that's kind of undeserved, so definitely check it out if you want to try to give a French map a try. And I think it's especially good for this case because I'm looking to build a small to medium-sized French city because, well, obviously I'm trying to do this thing in just one episode. I'm not going to do any other videos on this, but at least I still wanted to build a large enough city at a detailed enough scale that it would be overall believable and you'd be able to get a feeling for what a French city could look like. And I think the scale of this map is just right for that. It also has very natural, realistic terraforming, a basic road layout in place, so you have some highways and some exits and stuff like that, and also train line, but really nothing else. So I think it's a very good starting map. And Bion in general is a city with a great layout for this kind of thing. As you could tell at the start of this video, if you noticed it before I quickly terraformed all of it away, it's a star fort city in real life. It still has its old fortifications. I took some of those away because many French cities don't have them anymore, and you can tell that some 19th century infill has very often happened in these places, and the same goes for this fictional French city that I'm working on, and it just makes my life a little bit easier. Same goes for the city layout. Now, Jez told me that the preview map that he built for the French pack was based on Lyon in France because it's a city with a very straight gridded layout, but that also goes for quite a few other cities. I recently visited Rennes, which is in Normandy, I believe, if I remember correctly. Otherwise I'm gonna make some French people very mad. It also has a very grid style layout, and then obviously with cities like Paris, there have also been big urban renewals in the 19th century to create big squares and plazas and boulevards and roundabouts, so planned-esque city layouts are something that you see very often in France, which is good for this kind of building pack because these buildings are suited very well, I think, especially for that kind of layout. Don't make your roads too squiggly and really try to stick to grid-ish layouts with maybe some diagonal roads going through or a slightly off-kilter grid, that kind of vibe, but definitely also some large boulevards and plazas in the middle of it, like this. This is my starting off point, and I'm using what is technically the police station building in the top left there as my sort of city hall looking building with a big rectangular square in front of it, and as is very Haussmann-esque, I'm also putting very similar buildings all alongside this square, and especially the buildings right next to the square are all exactly the same. So something very good to notice again is that some of the corner buildings match up to some of the middle buildings in the French pack. So while this pack is really made to be used, not in the way that I'm using it right now, like it's just made to zone your city and get French buildings, I think once you get into that plop the growables mood, or you're using the developer menu as I'm doing here, you can combine some of these buildings into very particular kind of architectural elements. For instance, the French Boulevard, where every building is basically exactly the same, has its balconies and floors on the same height and identical mansard roofs. So I think I should say mansard. Well, my French isn't too good, but it is what it is. But yeah, I think the pack is really good for this kind of thing, so that's also why I decided to use it this way. But keep in mind that this pack is meant to also be used a little bit more user-friendly, which is also why it has all the different levels, and why you can tell in my developer menu over there, it has a bunch of buildings in there. There are so many assets in this. I actually don't know by heart how many it is, but it's probably in the hundreds. And they are all also different, so yeah, definitely go play with the individual buildings if you're into that kind of detailing. I think it's very fun, and also ends up very realistic if you're really looking for a particular look. Now over here, I was thinking of continuing the grid in a very simple manner for a little bit, and then I figured, no, I'm actually going to have this church on a sort of off-grid position, and this is something that you see very often in French cities. You'll notice some streets or buildings are still there from the medieval city layout, for instance, but somewhere in the more recent centuries, a city layout could have been modernized to make it more straight. I'm pretty sure that's what happened in Rennes as well, because the layout has very much gridded squares, but also some older buildings that don't quite fit into that grid. And I think that's the case with this cathedral over here. Obviously, it's the Notre Dame. It's not a very particular building of the city, but we're gonna just assume that this is our old medieval church in our city, and it's probably still based on the old medieval layouts. It's kind of, you know, a little bit in a different direction than the other city grids, and it has its own round square around it, which is probably a little medieval leftover, but then the more modern grid started growing all around that in later ages. So that's kind of the organically grown-ish layouts that I'm going for, even though most of the city is still on a grid. Something else worth mentioning, by the way, which I haven't mentioned yet, but you've probably noticed, is that I didn't just plop down all of these buildings. Obviously, I did use the developer mode to place them down, but every building is placed in a zone, and also the corresponding zone. Now this has something to do with, I think it's the fact that mods weren't quite working yet for this newest update, because while I had early access to check out the creator pack and make this showcase video, I'm also on a newer version of the game, which updated just around the same time, and some of the mods still had to be updated to fix some issues. Move It, for instance, was causing some lag for a little bit until Cuboid fixed that. And, well, those are obviously the kind of things that you have to go through sometimes when the game is updated, and the mods need to update along with it. But with these early access scenarios, it sometimes takes a little bit of time for everything to work. So Move It wasn't too much of an issue, but for some reason Plop the Growables was doing something with the UI of the game that didn't make it very usable. And I later got to fix that, but it means that as a consequence, all of these buildings are actually placed on their corresponding zone, because if I didn't do that, they would just start complaining that they're not in the right place. But as I speak right now, so a few days after the early access started, everything was alright for me again, so I could technically just place buildings right now without the corresponding zones, which I'll definitely do later in the video. But the entire city center is, as a funny consequence of this, entirely on the right zones and also entirely on the grid, which, to be honest, isn't even that much of an issue. It kind of goes to show that being on the grid and on the right zones means that you don't have quite as much control as when you mod the game completely and you can plop down growables wherever you want, and maybe even use anarchy to place one inside another one. But even if you just have that restriction to the right zones and the right zoning type, you can still make a very believable, realistic city with this mod. So I think that also goes to show that even though I am plopping down everything here, with just zoning, you can go quite far as well. Especially if you're staying on a grid, I think you could make a realistic French-looking city in like an hour. Just placing down a grid, zoning all the parts, and also making sure that you give them the different zones, because it's a huge shame to miss out on the huge variety of buildings in this pack if you just place down, for instance, medium residential or office zones, because There are a bunch of zones in this mod, and all of them have slightly unique buildings that all are pretty similar, and they work together very well, but you won't get the entire assortment of buildings in this mod if you just stick to the ones that you might be familiar with, or you might think, I'm just gonna make my entire city mixed zoning. So that's also something that's worth pointing out. Also, I just placed that little building down there, that little brown apartment block, which is one of the low rent buildings in the pack. Most of the buildings in this pack are very Parisian based, but the low rent buildings, well, they might also be based on Paris, but just not the city center. It's a very different kind of France that we might not pay as much attention to, or that tourists aren't visiting France for, but it still adds a touch of realism, and I think those buildings are very useful as well, so I'll definitely bring them back later in this map as well. Now, I'm gonna skip forward a little bit and move to a different part of the map. Here I added the school, which is absolutely huge, but I think it fits just right into this city block, and sometimes you just need a slightly larger block, and I think it's really cool that with these kind of large grids, these buildings are just the right thing, where you can have buildings behind buildings, and these very long galleries even behind just the facades, which in many French cities, but Paris especially, looking at it from Google Maps, there are so many buildings in the city that you can't see from the street because the buildings just continue to the back so far, and it's so incredibly dense because of that. Paris is one of the densest cities in the world, if not the densest. Obviously, that's a title that's a bit hard to distinguish because there are cities in the world which have very dense areas which might not be, statistically as well put together. So there are probably some denser places in the world that just don't show up on statistics. But overall, comparing it to most European cities or most Western countries, it's insanely dense. The buildings are huge, many of them don't have elevators, and the apartments are small, and it's just crazy how many people they fit into that city. So I'm kind of also emulating this here, but also not quite. I'm also sticking more to the low-level buildings in the pack because it means that I'm not getting as many floors as you might get if you're working on a Paris recreation, for instance. Now, I'm gonna skip ahead again because that whole video is just gonna be more of the same. I almost filled in the entire city center with these hand-plopped buildings, and at this point, I figured it was time to go to another part of the city. Now, in hindsight, maybe I was a bit too ambitious with this, because this makes the city so much larger, and again, I wanted to just build this city for this showcase video, so maybe it's a bit much, but I decided to move to this area and make a station area, which is, I think, realistically a good option to do, because, well, you would find these kinds of areas in many French cities, but also it's something that took quite a bit of effort. And it is an interesting showcase of how you could mix the buildings from the French pack with other buildings, because that's another relevant question, right? These French pack buildings are all quite tall and they're really based on a city center, but you always have these areas where the old city center transitions to the suburbs, and the suburbs in France, like most other countries, are just consisting of low suburban homes and would also be right to be filled in by either simple row houses or even standalone detached houses. So you're looking for that kind of transitional area, and very often train stations in medium-sized cities in France happen to be on that sort of transitional area because they've been built in the 18th or 19th century, right along the edge of the historic city center and where you start moving into the suburbs. So for this station area, it's a place where I mix some of the dense French pack buildings with the waterfront buildings, which is also something that I'm doing here. And that means also having some streets with maybe a few buildings from the French pack, a few buildings from the waterfront, and maybe also a few row houses or just regular low level, medium or low zone residential buildings. It's something about finding the right mix between different buildings, but overall, I'm pretty happy with how these buildings mix, because not every city can look entirely like Paris, and it's quite a challenge to try and make those transitional areas. Here it's another one of these neighborhoods with mostly just detached homes. I decided to put a few French buildings here on the corner, close to the city center, because it feels like this road over here, for instance, and some of the other roads that I placed down here are some of the roads radiating from the old city center and might be roads that have been here for hundreds of years, and also some of the first roads where new buildings were built after the old medieval city walls were taken down. So those are some of the roads where you might find some taller and older buildings, but in between those roads, alongside the small streets, you'll find often very small detached houses. Also, this is an area where I figured I have just the right playground to build myself a tiny banlieue looking area. So a suburban area with flats, which is something that you'll find in many French cities. They really like their, what I should call Corbusier style towers in the park architecture. And towers in the park is often a term that architects use for this kind of thing, where you have apartment buildings with a lot of green space and also parking lots in between. And it's a way in which many suburban communities in larger French cities with a higher density than your typical detached house community and also lower housing prices. It's a way in which many of those kind of neighborhoods have been built. So you can find many neighborhoods like this scattered around Paris, for instance. And personally, I think the low rent buildings from the French pack combine very well with the low rent buildings from the vanilla game. If you take a couple of them and plop them down using Plop the Growables or the developer menu, you can combine them into pretty realistic looking apartment complexes, I think. So that was my attempt over here. And then for the rest of this area, I'm going to fill this all in with simple low-level detached houses, which the same goes for the entire surroundings for the city. So I'm not going to share too much of my footage doing this. My basic strategy was just putting down all of these houses and then putting trees in between them. And that is basically it. I think those were the most interesting things to showcase about me building the city. Now, I want to take a quick look at how it looks in real life and take you through some of the highlights. So let's take a look. So here we are. Here's the final results. And I just wanted to give a quick overview without any UI so that you can see what the city center ended up looking like. And I think altogether, we've got the general look of it down. It's got the resemblance of a medium-sized city center where you can tell where the medieval walls would have been for the historic city center, but within that we have some different neighborhoods, like for instance the church with around it a more medieval messy street landscape, but then also over here we have the more gridded square part of the city. And if I zoom in here, you can see some of the viewpoints that you have from here as well, and just the overall atmosphere of the French Regent Pack buildings once you get down to street level. And of course also the riverside here. And that's, I think, what's most relevant to point out about the city center. Maybe a couple interesting buildings here and there, like for instance the college building, which is based on, of course, a real building in Paris, as well as the police station, which I used as a make-believe city hall here because I think it fits right in. But the actual city hall is in here as well, which could have been maybe another type of building, who knows. So that's it for the city center. Then we have, of course, the park around it with the water tower from, which is interesting to point out, it's the water tower from right next to the Sacré-Cœur in Paris. And also the more modern social housing blocks over here. And finally, the station area with some more messy urban fabric with here and there some very typical French architecture, but also mixed in with it some row houses and some of the waterfront houses and other more low density residential areas. So, zooming out again, this is basically the end result. It could have been a bit more detailed, but overall, for one episode and for a quick build to showcase the Regent Pack, I'm decently happy with it. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that it gave you a bit of an idea or some inspiration on how to use the French pack. Of course, this isn't everything. You can also just play it vanilla and put down your zones and these buildings will grow. Or maybe you want to get into more detail. I think it works perfectly for that as well. In any case, I hope it was a decent showcase for you and that you enjoyed the video. Big props to Jazz, Groony, Jaren and Revo for their work on this pack. And yeah, take care everybody.